This is a story about a woman who spent 2 years disappearing from her own life without realizing it was happening, and the Tuesday evening that finally made her stop. It's about 6 people sitting in a living room they had no right to occupy, a husband who couldn't understand what he was losing until it was already gone, and the fierce, steady reclaiming of a life that had been taken piece by piece. My name is Clara. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I got myself back. The woman who had built something beautiful and didn't yet know how easily it could be taken apart. I was a pediatric occupational therapist at a children's rehabilitation center in a mid-sized city that sat somewhere between sleepy and stirring. It was work I had spent 7 years training for, 4 years of undergraduate study, 2 years of graduate school, a year of supervised clinical practice, and it was work that I genuinely, deeply loved. Not in the way people say they love their jobs when they're trying to convince themselves, but in the specific, difficult, sustaining way that comes from knowing you are doing something that matters. I worked with children who had developmental delays, sensory processing disorders, cerebral palsy, autism spectrum conditions. Children whose bodies and minds worked differently than the world expected, and who needed someone to help them find their way through that gap. I was good at this work, not because I was naturally gifted, although I suppose I had some aptitude for it, but because I had learned to pay attention, to notice the small things. The way a child's hands moved when they were frustrated, the specific quality of silence that meant they were about to give up, the almost invisible shift in a parent's expression when they realized their child might never be what they had imagined. I had learned to hold space for other people's grief and hope and fear without letting it consume me. I had learned to be present without being overwhelmed. These were skills that served me well in my professional life. As I would discover later, they were also skills that made it easier for me to endure things I should have refused to accept. The apartment was mine. I had bought it when I was 31, with money I had saved over a decade of careful living. It was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building on a quiet street with a bakery on one corner and a pharmacy on the other, and a park 3 blocks east where I ran on mornings when I had the energy. The apartment had west-facing windows that turned the living room amber in the late afternoon, and I had furnished it slowly and deliberately, the way you do when you're doing it alone. Every piece was chosen because I actually wanted it there. The armchair by the window, upholstered in a fabric I had spent 2 weeks selecting. The small dining table that could seat 4 but usually just seated 1. The painting of a street in Lisbon that I had found at a flea market and hung myself, measuring 3 times before driving the nail into the wall. This apartment was not just where I lived. It was proof of something, proof that I could build a life on my own terms, proof that solitude was not the same thing as loneliness, proof that I was someone who could make decisions and live with their consequences. I loved that apartment the way you love something you have created with your own hands. Not perfectly, not without occasional frustration when the pipes made noise or the neighbors played music too loud, but deeply. Mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before. I met Marcus at a friend's birthday dinner 2.5 years before the Tuesday that changed everything. He was a civil engineer, tall in a way that made people notice him when he entered a room, considered in the manner of someone who thought before he spoke. He had a dry humor that appeared gradually, like something he was deciding to trust you with. I remember sitting across from him at that dinner and noticing the way he listened. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. When I told him what I did, he asked questions that showed he had actually processed the answer. When someone made a joke at my expense, something mild, forgettable, he didn't laugh. He just looked at me with an expression that said he understood the joke had been at my expense and wasn't interested in participating. I thought, here is someone who sees me. We dated for 8 months. He was kind, he was thoughtful. He remembered small details, my coffee order, the name of my first pet, the fact that I hated surprises. He never pushed. He never demanded. He seemed, in all the ways that mattered, to respect my independence. When his lease ended 8 months into our relationship and he suggested moving into my apartment, his apartment was smaller, he said, and mine had better light, and we spent most nights together anyway. I agreed. I agreed with the particular warm confidence of a woman who had waited long enough for the right person and believed she had finally found him. We married 13 months later. A small wedding, 60 guests, my aunt's garden in late September. The leaves were just beginning to turn. Marcus cried a little during the vows. I remember watching his face and thinking that the tears meant something, that they were evidence of a capacity for feeling, for vulnerability, for the kind of love that doesn't just endure but transforms. I was wrong about what the tears meant, although I wouldn't understand that for another 2 years. But in that moment, standing in my aunt's garden with my hand in his and the autumn air carrying the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, I believed I had found my person. His family was large. I had known this going in. His parents lived an hour away in the house where Marcus had grown up, a sprawling suburban place with a backyard that could accommodate 30 people for summer barbecues. He had 2 brothers, both married, both with children. He had aunts and uncles and cousins and family friends who functioned as cousins. They operated as a unit in the way of certain families, loud, overlapping, constantly moving in and out of each other's lives with the casual intimacy of people who had never learned to separate. Holidays were not events. They were sieges. 50 people in a house built for 20, children underfoot, conversations happening at 3 different volumes simultaneously, food appearing from nowhere in quantities that suggested someone had been cooking for days. I had grown up in a quieter family, an only child of 2 people who loved each other but kept their worlds small. My parents had friends, but those friendships were maintained through scheduled dinners and annual Christmas cards. When relatives visited, there were plans, dates agreed upon in advance, clear expectations about how long the visit would last and what would happen during it. I had grown up with the understanding that other people's time and space were not mine to assume. Marcus's family initially seemed like abundance. All that warmth, all that noise, all those people who welcomed me into their group with embraces and opinions and homemade food pressed into my hands at every gathering. I remember the first Christmas after we started dating, standing in his parents' living room surrounded by people whose names I was still learning, feeling something close to wonder. This, I thought, this is what family is supposed to feel like. So many people, so much love, so much belonging. What I didn't understand, what I would understand only slowly, incrementally, the way you understand that a room is getting colder not when the temperature drops, but when you finally notice you've been holding your arms across your chest for an hour, was that welcoming me into the group and respecting the boundaries of my home were, for them, entirely unrelated propositions. First time Marcus's brother and his wife came to stay for a long weekend, I was informed 2 days before. I remember standing in the kitchen, Marcus's phone to his ear, his face arranging itself into that expression of mild apology he wore when he was about to deliver news he suspected I wouldn't like. "David and Sarah want to visit," he said. "They're thinking this weekend." I felt a small tug of something, irritation, concern, but pushed it down. "This weekend," I said. "That's in 2 days." "They're driving through," Marcus said. "It made sense to stop. You don't mind, right? They're family." I didn't mind, or I told myself I didn't mind. I cleaned the guest room. I bought extra groceries. I cooked dinner on Friday night while David and Sarah sat in the living room with Marcus, laughing about something I couldn't hear. When they left on Sunday, I stood in the doorway waving goodbye and thought, that wasn't so bad. The second time, I was informed 1 day before. The third time, I found out when I came home to find their car in my parking spot. I walked into my own apartment to discover David on my couch, Sarah in my kitchen, their 2 children running circles around my coffee table. Marcus looked up with that expression, the one I was learning to recognize, and said, "Surprise, they were in the neighborhood." I smiled, the smile that cost nothing and meant nothing. I made conversation, I made dinner. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that this was my home, and no one had asked me if I wanted it to become a gathering place. By the 4th visit, I had stopped expecting notice at all. I raised it with Marcus each time, calmly, specifically, the way a therapist would raise it, I suppose, with care and precision and ultimately, although I didn't know this yet, insufficient force. I said, "I need to know when people are coming. I need to be consulted. This is my space too." He apologized each time. He said he'd talk to them. He said they were family. He said they didn't think of it as imposing. He said he'd make sure it didn't happen again. And each time it happened again, slightly worse than before, the way these things always do when there are no real consequences. I want to be specific about what slightly worse looked like in practice, because the tendency when describing this kind of accumulation is to sound petty, to sound like someone cataloging grievances too small to justify the feelings they produced. So let me be specific. Marcus's mother used my kitchen without asking and left it in a state I would not have left a stranger's kitchen. Dishes piled in the sink, crumbs on the counter, the remains of a meal she had prepared, her recipe, her choice, sitting out on the stove for hours after everyone had finished eating. When I came home from work that evening and found it, I spent 45 minutes cleaning up after a woman who had never once offered to clean up after herself. When I mentioned it to Marcus, he said, "She was trying to help. She wanted to contribute." I said, "Contributing means cleaning up after yourself." He said, "I'll talk to her." He did not talk to her, or if he did, it made no difference. Marcus's aunt rearranged my bathroom cabinet to make more room. "Darling, you had it so cluttered," she said without mentioning it to me beforehand. For 3 days, I couldn't find my own medication. I stood in my bathroom at midnight after a 12-hour shift, exhausted and aching, opening cabinet doors and finding things in places I hadn't put them. When I finally located my medication, behind a stack of towels she had decided needed reorganizing, I felt a flash of something close to rage. I pushed it down. I said nothing. I told myself this was what marriage looked like when you married into a big family. That the discomfort was mine to manage. That love required adjustment and flexibility and the willingness to hold your own needs loosely. None of this was true, but I believed it for long enough to let the apartment, my apartment, with its amber afternoon light and its carefully chosen furniture, and the park 3 blocks east, become something I was hosting in rather than living in. Marcus's brother's children drew on the wall in the hallway with a ballpoint pen, not a small drawing, a sweeping, looping scrawl that covered 2 feet of wall from baseboard to hip height. I discovered it on a Sunday morning, standing in the hallway with my coffee cup in hand, staring at the blue ink carved into the pale paint. When I pointed it out to their mother, gently, carefully, with the measured calm of someone who had learned to manage conflict, she laughed and said, "Kids will be kids." Then she told Marcus I had been cold to her. Marcus reported this to me later, carefully, in the way of someone relaying information they hope you'll take as constructive. I took it as constructive. I softened my manner. I drew the boundaries smaller. I touched up the paint myself and didn't mention it again. I want to pause here and name something. I was a grown woman. I was a professional. I was someone who had built a life and a career and a home entirely on her own. And yet, in the context of my marriage, I had become someone who apologized for being bothered. Someone who rearranged her own needs to accommodate people who hadn't asked if she had needs. Someone who smiled, the specific smile that costs nothing and means nothing, and said nothing when her boundaries were crossed, because saying something would make her difficult, would make her cold, would make her the kind of woman who couldn't handle the beautiful chaos of a big, loving family. This is what erosion looks like. Not one dramatic event, not one unforgivable betrayal. 1,000 small moments of being told, in ways both subtle and direct, that your comfort is less important than someone else's convenience, that your space is not really yours, that your feelings are something to be managed rather than honored. And slowly, without fully realizing it, you begin to manage them yourself. You begin to treat your own reactions as problems to be solved. You begin to apologize for the inconvenience of existing, for the trouble of having preferences, for the audacity of wanting your home to feel like your home. This is what happened to me. This is what I let happen. And it continued, week after week, month after month, until the Tuesday in November when I came home after 10 hours on my feet to find 6 people sitting in my living room like they'd always lived there. I had had a genuinely hard day. One of my young patients, a 6-year-old boy named Ethan with cerebral palsy, had experienced a significant setback. Ethan had been working with me for 14 months. 14 months of twice-weekly sessions, of exercises designed to strengthen his core and improve his balance, of games played with specific therapeutic goals embedded in their structures. He had been making progress. Real, measurable progress. His mother had started talking about him joining a recreational soccer league, something she had never imagined possible a year earlier. And then, on that Tuesday, something shifted. I noticed it during our session. The way his left side seemed less responsive, the way his gait had changed almost imperceptibly, the way he tired more quickly than he had the week before. I ran some assessments. I made some calls. By the end of the day, I had confirmed what I had suspected. Ethan's condition had progressed in ways that would require a significant adjustment to his treatment plan. I had spent 2 hours on the phone with his parents, explaining what I had observed, what it meant, what we could do next. I had spent another 2 hours completing the paperwork that accompanied any significant change in care. I had left the center at 6:15, my body aching from 10 hours on my feet, my mind still processing the weight of the conversation I had just had. I had bought a tuna sandwich from the cafe on the ground floor of my building and eaten it in my car. I had sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes after I finished, staring at the steering wheel, too tired to move. I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has been in this situation enough times to have developed instincts about it, that I should not arrive home expecting peace. I didn't know exactly what I would find, but I knew enough to feed myself first, to protect the small reserves of energy I had left, to arrive with something in my stomach so I wouldn't be dependent on whatever I might, or might not, find in my own kitchen. I parked my car. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I put my key in the lock. I opened my door, and I found 6 people sitting in my living room like they had always lived there. On the couch sat Marcus's cousin Dimitri and his wife Lena. Dimitri's mother, Marcus's Aunt Alina, was in the armchair I had carried up 3 flights myself when I bought it, upholstered in the fabric I had spent 2 weeks choosing. 2 of Lena and Dimitri's children, 7 and 9, both boys, were on the floor in front of the television, which was on at a volume I would not have chosen. Marcus's younger brother, Petya, was in the kitchen doorway holding a beer I hadn't bought. Marcus was on the smaller sofa, and he looked up at me when I came in with an expression I had learned to read precisely over 2 years of marriage. It was the expression of a man who knows he has done something wrong and is betting on your decency, not to make it visible. "Clara," he said, standing. "You're home, come in, look who's here." I looked, I smiled. The smile was automatic, the one that costs nothing and means nothing. Alina rose to kiss my cheek, and I let her. Lena waved from the couch and said something about being in the neighborhood. The children did not look up from the television. Petya lifted his beer in a kind of greeting from the kitchen doorway. The kitchen, I noticed, had the beginning smell of something being cooked. Onions, something heavy, something that was going to take at least an hour. "I'm just going to change," I said pleasantly. I walked to the bedroom. I closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed in the half-dark and took off my shoes and held them in my lap for a moment. The television was audible through the wall. The smell of onions was stronger than I would have liked. I had eaten. I was tired. I had spent the last 3 hours managing other people's pain and distress professionally and competently. And I had nothing left. Absolutely nothing. For the performance required of the woman who has just come home to find 6 uninvited relatives installed in her living room and is expected to be delighted about it. I put my shoes neatly by the wardrobe. I changed into comfortable clothes. I opened my nightstand drawer and took out the novel I was in the middle of. I got into bed, propped the pillow against the headboard, and began to read. Marcus came in 14 minutes later. I know because I had been watching the clock with a specific detached interest in my own patience. "Hey," he said. He had closed the door behind him. "You okay?" "Fine," I said. I turned the page. "Are you coming out?" I looked up from the book. "No," I said. "Clara." He said my name like it was a complete sentence, containing within it an entire argument he didn't want to have to make explicitly. I set the book down, keeping my thumb in the page. "When did you know they were coming?" A pause. "This afternoon." "This afternoon," I repeated. "So you had several hours during which you could have called me." "I know I should have." "And instead you let me come home to find 6 people in our living room at 6:30 in the evening after a 10-hour shift." I picked the book back up. "I've eaten. I'm going to read. You're welcome to join me." "There are guests." "There are your guests," I said. "I didn't invite them." He stood in the doorway for a moment. I could feel him there, hovering in that particular way of a man who wants to argue but can't find the argument. And then he went back out and closed the door. And I listened to the muffled sounds of the living room settle back into themselves. And I read my book. I want to be clear about something. This was not the fight. This was not the moment when everything broke open. This was just a woman, very tired, reading a book in her own bedroom while her husband managed a social situation he had created without her consent. The fight was still coming. What that evening was a line. The first line I had drawn without immediately walking back across it. And I felt, turning pages in the amber lamplight, while onions fried in my kitchen without my permission, something shifting in me that I didn't yet have words for. The relatives left around 10 o'clock. I heard them go. The children rounded up, the coats distributed, the goodbyes in the hallway. Marcus's voice low and cheerful. Elena's voice warm and lingering. Then the door. Then quiet. He came back to the bedroom and I was still reading. He got ready for bed without speaking and lay down beside me. For a long while, neither of us said anything. Then, in the dark, he said, "You were rude." I turned a page. I was tired and I was hungry, and I wasn't told. They're family. So you keep saying. Another silence. Then, what did you want me to do? Tell them not to come? Yes, I said. Or at minimum, call me, or ask me, or acknowledge that this is also my home and I get a say in who is in it. I closed the book. Pick any of those. Pick all of them. What I didn't want was to walk into my living room after the day I had and find a dinner party I didn't know about in progress. You didn't even try, he said. You just walked away. I'd already eaten, I said. He turned the lamp off without responding. I lay in the dark and thought, this isn't about the food. He knows it isn't about the food. And the fact that he's pretending it's about the food is itself a piece of information. I filed it away and went asleep. The following 2 weeks were surface normal. Marcus was slightly cooler, slightly careful, in the way of a man who has decided the situation was your fault, but is smart enough not to say it directly. I was pleasant and present, and I did not apologize, which was new. I could feel him registering the absence of the apology like a sound he was waiting for that didn't come. His family texted him more than usual. I noticed this not because I was surveilling his phone, but because he would go quiet for a few minutes and then emerge from the silence with that particular expression, the bet on your decency expression. I had begun to find it tiring. Elena called me directly on the Thursday after the visit. I was at work and let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message in my car at lunch. She was worried. She could tell something was wrong. She didn't want any hard feelings. She hoped I understood that she and the family just wanted to be close to Marcus, and by extension, to me. It was how their family showed love. Her voice was warm and slightly wounded in exactly equal measure. And I recognized the combination, warmth and wound, a compound instrument played to produce a specific result. I thought she's good at this. Then I thought she's had a lot of practice. I texted back, "Thank you for calling, Elena. All fine here. Take care," and left it at that. That weekend, Marcus told me his parents were thinking of visiting the following weekend. He told me on Saturday morning over coffee, framing it carefully. "I wanted to give you plenty of notice this time." I looked at him over my mug and thought about the phrase, "this time." Its implication that the only problem before had been logistics, not the fundamental dynamic, not the absence of consultation, not the expectation that my home was available on demand to whoever his family decided to send. "Thank you for the notice," I said. "Are they staying here?" "Just the weekend," he said. "They don't want to be any trouble." I thought about that phrase, that specific phrase. They don't want to be any trouble. The phrase that is always deployed by people in the process of being tremendous trouble. "Marcus," I said, "I'd like us to talk about this, actually talk about it. Not just the parents next weekend. The whole pattern. I think we need a real conversation about how we handle family visits." He looked at me with the expression of a man who had been hopping for a different sentence. "Okay," he said without warmth. We sat at the kitchen table that morning, and I said what I had been holding for months, specifically and without accusation, in the measured cadences of a woman who had been trained professionally to communicate about hard things. I said that I loved his family. I said that I valued our connection to them. I said that I needed our home to be a place I could count on coming home to, not a venue that might contain anything on any evening. I said that I wasn't asking him to cut anyone off or change who his family was. I was asking for consultation, for advance notice, for the basic courtesy of being treated as a co-owner of the space we shared. He listened. He nodded in some places. He said he understood. He said he'd do better. He reached across the table and took my hand, and I looked at his hand over mine and tried to determine whether I believed him. I wanted to. That's the honest answer. I wanted very much to believe him because the alternative, that the conversation we had just had would produce the same outcome as all the previous conversations, was a conclusion I wasn't yet ready to sit with. So I chose to believe him. The way you choose to believe a weather forecast when you really need the day to be clear, with effort, with hope, and with a small practical voice in the back of my mind nodding that you should probably pack an umbrella anyway. His parents came the following weekend. They were perfectly pleasant, as they always were. I cooked on Saturday evening, and we had a nice dinner. Marcus was warm and attentive in the way he was when things were good, and I thought maybe this is what the conversation produces. Maybe it actually worked. On Sunday morning, I woke at 7 to the sound of a third voice in the kitchen. Not his mother, not his father. A voice I recognized after a moment as belonging to Marcus's cousin Andre, who lived 30 minutes away and had apparently called Marcus the night before to say he was driving through. And Marcus had said, "Come for breakfast," and had not mentioned this to me. I lay in bed and listened to the three of them talking in my kitchen. I thought, very clearly and very calmly, there it is. I was not angry yet. What I felt was closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow of a hope being confirmed as unfounded. I had given him the clearest possible account of what I needed. He had understood it, agreed to it, and then the first time an opportunity arose to practice it, had reverted entirely to the prior pattern without apparently thinking about it at all. Which meant either that the conversation had genuinely not registered, or that it had registered, and he had decided that registering was sufficient without requiring any actual change in behavior. Both possibilities were bleak. One was thoughtless. The other was something worse. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I said good morning to Andre, who was a perfectly nice person and bore no responsibility for his cousin's choices. I made myself coffee. I excused myself to go for a run. I ran for 45 minutes in the park 3 blocks east, the park I had known before Marcus. And I thought about what my life looked like from the outside and what it felt like from the inside, and how wide the gap between those two views had become. When I got home, Andre was gone. Marcus was washing dishes. He turned around and looked at me with the expression that had replaced the bet on your decency expression. Something slightly more apprehensive. The look of a man who is beginning to understand that the account he has been drawing on may be close to empty. "I forgot to mention Andre was coming," he said. "I know," I said. "It was just breakfast." "Marcus," I said. I was still in my running clothes, hair pulled back, probably still slightly flushed from the cold. "I'm going to shower. When I come out, I'd like to talk. Not about Andre specifically, about what happens now." "What do you mean, what happens now?" "I mean, I think we have a problem that's bigger than logistics. And I think we need to decide together whether we're going to solve it, actually solve it, not discuss it, and then return to default." I went to shower. And while the hot water ran over me, I thought about the list of options in front of me. And I thought about which one I could live with. And I thought about the word that had been forming in my mind for 3 months, gathering mass. The word I had been circling without letting myself land on it. The word was enough. The shower conversation, the one I'd promised and he'd been dreading, happened at the kitchen table again. Same chairs, same mugs, same window looking out at the street below. But something about the quality of the light was different that Sunday. Harder, maybe, less forgiving. Or perhaps I was just different and light is neutral, and I had been projecting warmth onto it all along. I told Marcus I needed him to understand something I had perhaps not communicated with sufficient directness before. And the reason I hadn't was that I had been operating under the assumption that softening the edges of a true thing made it easier for someone to accept. What I had learned was that softening the edges just made it easier to ignore. So I was going to say it directly. Your family treats our home like a hotel, I said. Not maliciously. I don't think they mean harm. But the effect is the same regardless of intent. I come home not knowing who will be there. I don't get consulted about guests. When I express discomfort, I'm described as cold or unwelcoming. And when we discuss it, you agree with me and nothing changes. I held my coffee mug in both hands. That's not a logistics problem. That's a priorities problem. And the priority that's consistently losing is me. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not thoughtful but defensive. The silence of someone sorting through available responses, looking for one that might diffuse without conceding. Finally, he said, "My family is important to me." "I know that," I said. "They've always been like this. It's how they are." "I know that too," I said. "My question is whether how they are is compatible with what I need, and whether that's something you want to work on, or whether it's something you've decided is simply fixed, that this is how your family operates and I need to adjust to it." He looked at me. "I don't think it's fair to make me choose." "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your family," I said. "I'm asking you to choose between two versions of our marriage, one where I'm a full partner whose needs have equal weight, and one where I'm managing around your family's access to our space indefinitely and pretending it's fine." I set my mug down. "Those are the two options. I'd like to know which one you're choosing." The silence that followed was longer than the first one. Outside, a bus went past. Someone's dog barked twice and stopped. Marcus looked at the table, and I looked at Marcus, and I felt, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that I was about to find out something I had not known for certain until this moment. He said, "I don't think you're being reasonable." There it was, not "I hear you and I want to do better." Not "you're right and I've been taking you for granted." Not even a negotiation, a counteroffer, an attempt to meet somewhere in the middle, just "I don't think you're being reasonable," which was not a response to what I'd said. It was a verdict on the person who had said it. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he repeated. "I needed to know where you stood," I said. "Now I do." I got up and rinsed my mug and went to the bedroom and called my friend Natasha, who had been hearing my version of this story in installments for 8 months, and who answered on the second ring with the specific alertness of someone who has been waiting for this call. "Tell me," she said. And I did. Natasha had a spare room. She offered it before I had finished the second paragraph of my account, in the decisive, no-nonsense way of a woman who has watched a friend diminish gradually and has been preparing her response. I told her I wasn't ready to move, that I needed a few days to think, that I wasn't going to make decisions in the hot wash of the Sunday morning conversation. She said, "Fine, but the offer stands, and it doesn't expire." What I did instead of moving immediately was something I had learned in 3 years of working with children and families who were navigating crisis. I documented, not aggressively, not with hostility, just carefully. I wrote down the dates and details of the last 6 months of uninvited visits. I noted the conversation Marcus and I had had about the pattern. I noted the Andre breakfast. The following morning, I wrote down what Marcus had said to me that Sunday. "I don't think you're being reasonable." I kept the notebook in my bag. I also called my father that evening. My father, unlike Marcus's family, called before he visited, usually 2 weeks in advance, always framing it as a question rather than an announcement. He was a retired accountant with a quiet manner and a talent for identifying the structural problem beneath the surface problem. When I told him what was happening, the full version, not the softened one, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, "The apartment is yours." Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," I said. "You bought it before the marriage." "Yes." "And the mortgage is in your name." "Yes. We've been splitting costs since he moved in, but the deed and the mortgage are mine." "Good," he said quietly, practically. The word landing like something being set firmly on a table. Keep that in mind. I did. The week that followed had the strange, overvivid quality of days you know are going to matter. Marcus and I moved around each other with the careful politeness of two people who have said real things and are waiting to see what the real things produce. He did not bring up Sunday's conversation. He did not apologize. He was not unkind, just absent, in the way of a man who has retreated into his routines as a form of defense. Doing the dishes, watching his shows, going to work. Keeping to the shallow register of daily life, where nothing important could be said or decided. I went to work and saw my patients and came home and made dinner and ate it and cleaned up. And I thought, every evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the amber light coming through the west-facing windows, how long can I do this? Not as a dramatic question. Genuinely, practically, how long can I maintain this version of my life before it costs me something I can't get back? On Thursday, Alina called again. This time I answered. Clara, she said, warm and immediately purposeful. I've been thinking about you. Are you and Marcus all right? We're navigating some things, I said, which was true and revealed nothing. I spoke to him, she said, and something in my chest went tight. He's very hurt, you know. He feels like you've been pulling away from the family, like you don't want us around. I held the phone and breathed. Alina, I said, what did Marcus tell you? Just that things have been difficult lately. That you've been unhappy about family visits. Did he tell you that he and I had a conversation last Sunday about what I need from our marriage? A slight pause. He mentioned there had been some tension. Did he tell you what I said during that conversation? Another pause. He said you felt the family visited too much. I told him I needed to be consulted before guests came to our home. I said I needed to be treated as a partner in this marriage. Those are the things I said. I paused. The fact that Marcus summarized that as me not wanting the family around is itself informative. Alina was quiet for a moment. Then, in a slightly different tone, still warm but with something underneath it that was harder. A note of authority that her warmth had been covering, the way a tablecloth covers an unfinished table. Clara, you married into a family. That means adjustments. Yes, I said. It means adjustments from everyone, including me, which I have been making, and including Marcus, which he has not. He loves you very much. I believe that, I said. Love and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. She said, you know, it would mean a great deal to all of us if you came to the family dinner on Saturday. It might help smooth things over. I noticed the word smooth. The way it implied that the surface was what needed work, not the structure beneath it. I'll think about it, I said. Thank you for calling, Alina. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet office, the afternoon light fading outside the window. And I thought, Marcus called his aunt before he talked to me again. He went to his family with our conflict before he came to me with an apology, which meant that whatever sorting he was doing in his private internal life, he was sorting it in their direction, not mine. He was triangulating. Bringing his family into our marriage to manage a conflict that existed in our marriage, because managing it with his family present was something he knew how to do, and managing it alone with me was something he apparently did not. I drove home that night and did not stop for a sandwich. I was not hungry. I sat in the parking lot outside our building for 15 minutes instead, looking at the lit windows on the third floor. Our windows, amber and warm, and I thought about the life on the other side of those windows, and whether it was still the life I had planned to live. Inside, Marcus was making dinner. He'd made pasta, my preferred kind, and there was a glass of white wine on the table at my place. He looked up when I came in with an expression that was a tempting warmth, but running slightly thin at the edges, like paint applied over a surface it wasn't quite sticking to. Alina called me, he said. She said you talked. We did, I said. I put my bag down and hung up my coat. She thought the Saturday dinner might be a good idea, a chance to. Marcus, I said. I sat down at the table. Did you tell your aunt about our conversation before you spoke to me again about it? He was quiet. Because I want to understand the sequence, I said. We have a conversation Sunday morning where I tell you what I need. You say I'm being unreasonable. Monday through Thursday, you speak to your aunt about it. She calls me Thursday to suggest I come to a family dinner to smooth things over. I looked at him steadily. At what point in that sequence did you plan to come back to me? His jaw tightened. I was thinking about it. You were managing it, I said. With your family, which is what you always do. You don't bring it to me, you bring it to them. And then they come to me with a solution that happens to involve me being more available to them. I picked up the wine glass and held it. That's not a marriage, Marcus. That's a system I happen to be living inside of. He sat down. For a moment, he just looked at me. And what I saw in his face was not the bet on your decency expression and not the apprehensive one. What I saw was something raw. And I want to be fair, I think it was genuine. I think he looked at me in that moment and saw, perhaps for the first time clearly, the gap between what he'd been offering and what I'd needed. And the length of time that gap had been open. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might say the thing that could have changed the direction we were moving. He said, I don't know how to make you happy. I put the wine glass down. I know, I said. And that was the saddest thing I said in the whole conversation, because it was true, and because it was not an accusation but a diagnosis, and because I understood in that moment that not knowing how to make me happy and not being willing to try were, for Marcus, functionally the same thing. I ate the pasta, it was good. I told him so. We watched something on television. I went to bed. He came to bed later. We lay in the dark like two people who have run out of sentences, which is its own kind of answer. The family dinner was Saturday. I did not go. I told Marcus Friday evening that I was going to pass on it, that I had some things I needed to take care of. I hoped he had a good time. He looked at me for a long moment and then nodded once, the nod of a man who has lost the argument but isn't ready to say so, and went without me. I heard him leave at 6:15. And I sat in the quiet apartment and felt the specific piece of a space that was, for a few hours, only mine. I called Natasha. I called my father. I made tea and sat in the armchair, the one I'd carried up 3 flights, and looked at the amber light, which had no loyalty to anyone and was simply itself. And I let myself think the thought I had been circling for weeks. I wanted him to leave. Not out of hatred, not out of desire for revenge or the satisfaction of punishment. I wanted him to leave because I was 34 years old and I had built a good life that I was good at living. And somewhere in the course of a marriage that had seemed like abundance and had turned out to be a slow dispossession, I had lost the particular quality of ease I'd had in this apartment before he moved in. And I wanted it back. I wanted to come home to a space that was mine and know that it would be mine when I arrived. I wanted to make a cup of tea without doing math about who else might be here. I wanted the dish cabinet and the bathroom and the armchair and the west-facing windows in the late afternoon to be simple again, to be just what they were and not a negotiation. I wanted my life back. And sitting in the quiet apartment on a Saturday evening while my husband ate dinner with the family that had eaten mine, I understood that wanting it was not enough. I would have to do something about it. I spoke to a lawyer on Monday. My father had a name. He always had a name, my father, because he had spent his life in the quiet, thorough way of cautious people, collecting information in case it became useful. I called from my car at lunch and explained the situation. I was given an appointment for Wednesday. Her name was Vera Sokolova, and she had the precise, unsentimental manner of someone who deals in facts rather than feelings and respects you enough not to pretend the facts are comfortable. I brought the documents I'd assembled. The deed in my name, the mortgage papers, the spreadsheet of shared household expenses I had been keeping for the past 2 years without entirely knowing why. She went through them efficiently, then she looked up and said, "You've been thorough." I said, "I've been careful." She nodded as though those were the same thing and explained my position. The apartment was mine, legally, unambiguously, documented in every relevant way. Marcus had no claim to it. Our financial entanglement was limited to the shared accounts we had opened for joint expenses, accounts that would need to be addressed, but contained no significant assets either of us would dispute. The situation was, in legal terms, clean. What it would not be was easy or fast or comfortable. Are you certain? She asked before we went any further. I've been certain for 3 weeks, I said. I've been waiting to make sure the certainty was real and not just reactive. She nodded again. Then let's talk about what comes next. What came next began on Friday evening. Marcus came home from work at 6:30. I was in the kitchen, not cooking, which was the first thing he noticed. The absence of dinner, the cold stove, me sitting at the table with my hands around a cup of tea and a folder on the surface in front of me. He looked at the folder, then at me, and something in his posture shifted. The way a person's body adjusts before the mind fully processes what it's looking at. Sit down, I said, not unkindly, just directly. He sat. I told him what I had decided. I told him that I had spent 6 months trying to have a conversation that would produce a different outcome, and that the conversation had produced the same outcome each time, and that I understood now that this was not a failure of communication, but a reflection of our actual incompatibility. I told him that I wanted him to move out. I told him the apartment was mine and had always been mine, that I was not asking him to leave my life, that was his choice to make, but that I was asking him to leave my home. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer, that the process was straightforward, that I wanted to handle it with dignity and as little damage as possible. He listened. He was very still. When I finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Is this because of my family?" I thought about how to answer that. "It's because of us," I said finally. "Your family is the place where us became visible. But the problem isn't your aunt or Dimitri or Alina. The problem is that I have been telling you what I need for months, and you have consistently chosen not to hear it. Not because you're a bad person, because hearing it would have required you to do something difficult. And doing something difficult where your family is concerned is something you're not able to do. And I cannot build a life with someone who is not able to do that." He said, "You could have tried harder." "I tried for 6 months," I said. "I tried with conversations and with patience and with adjustments and with giving you the benefit of the doubt when the doubt had run out. I am done trying in a direction that doesn't go anywhere." I paused. "I don't want to fight about this. I'm not angry. I'm just finished." He looked at me for a long time. His face was doing several things at once. Grief, anger, the specific wounded pride of a man who has been told a thing he cannot argue against. Then he stood up, pushed his chair back, went to the bedroom. I heard the sounds of things being moved, the wardrobe opening. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, which had gone cold, and listened to my husband pack a bag. He left that night to stay at his brother's. He kissed my forehead at the door, which surprised me, and said, "I'm sorry I wasn't better." And I looked at him and thought, me too. I genuinely thought, me too. The weeks after that had a strange quality, sad and quiet, and also, underneath the sadness, something that kept presenting itself when I wasn't guarding against it. Relief. It arrived in the mornings first. I would wake up and the apartment would be still. The light would come through the west-facing windows in its amber way, and I would lie in bed for a moment and know, with the clean certainty of something restored, that nobody was going to come through the door today without my prior knowledge, that the kitchen was mine, and the bathroom cabinet was mine, and the armchair and the linen closet and the Saturday mornings were mine. It was a small thing in the way that breathing is a small thing, unremarkable when present, its absence the whole world. Alina called, as I knew she would. She called 3 times in the first 2 weeks, and on the third call, I answered. She was upset in a way that was not entirely performed. There was real distress in her voice. The distress of a woman who had watched a family she loved contract around a conflict she had contributed to creating. I let her speak. When she finished, I said, "Alina, I want you to know that I hold nothing against you personally. But I need you to understand that what happened between Marcus and me was not about a dinner or a visit or any one incident. It was about a pattern that Marcus and I couldn't resolve together. That's between us. Please don't take it as a statement about you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a quietness that I think was genuine, "I think we did ask too much of you." It cost her something to say that. I could hear it. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." We haven't spoken since, which is probably what's needed for now. Marcus and I reached our legal resolution in 8 weeks, as Vera had predicted. He was not unreasonable about it. That surprised me in a good way and made me think that the version of him I had once believed in was not entirely fictional, just insufficient for the life I needed. He took what was his. I kept what was mine. And we signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in Vera's office and walked out into the cold streets separately, going in different directions. Which is also its own kind of answer. My father came to visit the second weekend of March. He drove 4 hours, arrived at noon, parked in the right parking spot because I had texted him which one was free, knocked on my door instead of having a key because I had not yet given him one. When I opened the door, he looked at me for a moment, taking inventory in the way he does, the way he has always done, measuring whether the person in front of him matches the voice he has been hearing on the phone. Then he said, "You look well." "I am," I said. "Not surprisingly," he said, and came inside. We cooked together that afternoon, the way we had when I was growing up. Him handling the parts that required precision, me handling the parts that required intuition. Both of us moving around each other in a kitchen with the easy efficiency of people who have been doing this together for decades. He replaced a hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been loose for months. He asked about my patients, and I told him about Ethan, who had had a breakthrough the week before that had made his mother cry in my office. And my father listened with the full attention he has always given to things I tell him about my work. When we sat down to eat, he looked around the apartment, the amber light, the armchair, the Lisbon painting back on the wall where I had rehung it. And he said, "It looks like you." "It does now," I said. He nodded once, the nod of a practical man who understands that some statements don't require elaboration. It's been 4 months since Marcus moved out, long enough to have settled into a shape, the new life. Long enough for it to feel like mine rather than like a temporary arrangement I'm borrowing until something more permanent arrives. My mornings are quiet. My evenings are mine to plan. I have had Natasha for dinner twice and my colleague Ramai once and my father every other weekend. And each time someone comes through my door, it is because I have chosen it, because I have said yes, because the invitation was mine to give. I'm not without sadness. I want to be honest about that, because the story of the woman who reclaims her life and finds that everything is better and simpler and freer afterwards is not entirely the story I'm living. I miss certain things. Not many, but some. The sound of another person in the apartment on a Sunday morning. The ease of early love before it revealed its limits. The version of Marcus that had been possible in a different life with a different inheritance. I mourn those things at odd moments. In the way you mourn things that were always a little theoretical, with something that is not quite grief and not quite regret, but lives in the neighborhood of both. What I don't mourn is the 6 relatives on the couch. What I don't mourn is the 3 mugs set out by automatic reflex. What I don't mourn is the smile that cost nothing and meant nothing, the one I wore like a tool. I have not worn that smile since. I went for a run last Saturday morning in the park 3 blocks east. The park I have known since before any of this. It was early enough to be cold. The kind of pale winter cold that makes the light look clean and particular, and I ran my usual loop, and then sat on a bench for a few minutes before heading back, the way I sometimes do when I'm not in a hurry, which I often am not anymore. A dog came and put its head briefly against my knee and then moved on. 2 children argued about something and resolved it without adult intervention. The bakery on the corner was opening. I could smell it from the park. Bread and something sweet. The kind of smell that asks nothing from you and gives you something anyway. I sat there for a while. I wasn't in a hurry. The apartment would be there when I got back. Amberlit. Quiet. Mine. Nobody would be in it that I hadn't invited. The cabinet hinge was fixed. The dish rack was where I kept it. The cedar blocks were in the linen closet. The Lisbon painting was at the height I had chosen. The door had my name on the lease, and the lock answered to my key. I got up and ran home. Some things, when you get them back, you understand for the first time how much they always cost. My ordinary life. The one I had before, the quiet street, the good light, the park, the bakery, the amber evenings, had not been ordinary at all. It had been something I'd built carefully over years and given away piece by piece in the belief that love required it. It does not. Love, the real kind, the kind worth keeping, does not ask for the thing you are. It works around the thing you are. It learns its way through the space you occupy without rearranging you to fit. I am learning again to occupy my own space without apology. It is going well. The door has my name on it. That is where I will leave this story, with that small, sufficient, entirely real fact. The door has my name on it, and I came home. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this.